The following podcast contains mature themes and is intended for an adult audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to this episode of Summa Made Simple. In this episode, we shall continue our discussion around the effects of lust or the daughters of lust, the things which lust brings in its wake. This is a continuation of the discussion around question 153 of part 2 of the second part of the Summa Theologica. Question 153, Article 5, whether the daughters of lust are rightly described or reckoned or ascribed. And in the previous episode, we'd been speaking about the first daughter of lust, which is blindness of mind. And in this episode, we shall continue from that point to the second daughter of lust. So remember the methodology which St. Thomas is using. He is looking at each of the acts, the internal acts which the intellect and the will carry out in order to discern and to discover and apprehend what is truly good, and then to go after what is truly good. And then he draws a parallel between what lust does to each one of those steps in terms of how to think through anything correctly or to think properly. He draws at every step, he says, this is how lust will affect how you think at this stage, and at that stage, and at that stage, and at that stage. And he said the first movement, the first action, the first stage of thinking of the intellect is to apprehend what is good. And in that respect, lust causes us to no longer correctly see or correctly discern what is good. Hence he called it blindness of mind. Moving on from there, the second act, the second internal invisible act of your intellect is counsel about what is to be done for the sake of the end. And this is also hindered by the concupiscence of lust. So counsel is that desire to seek advice and to draw advice from different sources. Now you could say, no, but counsel is a very external thing. Yeah, but that's if you look at it narrowly. If you think of seeking advice from the point of view of speaking to people who are alive, but you can also seek advice from people who are dead. That advice tends to be not in, seances and communicating, channeling spirits. No, it's reading books. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas is long dead, but look at the advice that he's giving us, right? So reading books is a way of seeking advice from dead people. Memory also, just remembering. Oh, I remember so-and-so told me this, and so-and-so told me that, or so-and-so told me that other thing, is part of this process of counsel, which, by the way, we'll get to it one day. When discussing prudence and making good decisions, St. Thomas says that one of the elements that's needed to be able to be prudent is a very good memory. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that one day, God willing. So the second internal act is counsel. Hence, Terence says, who was Terence? Think of Terence as kind of like the William Shakespeare of ancient Rome. He was like a playwright, very popular. The funny thing is, it's so difficult to find like performances of his plays now. It's very, very hard. You can just find the play text, but to find performances is difficult. I digress. Hence, Terence says in the Eunuch, Act 1, Scene 1, speaking of lecherous love, this thing admits of neither counsel nor moderation. Thou canst not control it by counseling. In this respect, there is rashness, which denotes absence of counsel, as stated above. Now, the third internal act. So we said rashness is this thing of not looking for advice, not trying to remember what you've come across, bits and pieces of advice you've heard from living people or from dead people. You just proceed without weighing up counsel. And the third act is judgment about the things to be done. And this again is hindered by lust. For it is said of the lustful old men in Daniel 13 verse 9, they perverted their own mind that they might not remember just judgments. In this respect, there is thoughtlessness. So what's the difference between rashness and thoughtlessness? Let's say, for instance, a person wants to get married to some woman who is very, very beautiful, very attractive. And that's his main reason for wanting to marry this woman, is that she looks incredible, right? So let's say he seeks advice. So he says, okay, let me do the right thing. Let me seek advice. And so he sits with some friends, some family, some relatives, and everyone is kind of tells him, if you really love her, go with what your heart is saying. That's person 1. Person 2, 3, 4, and 5 telling the exact same thing. Follow your heart. If you really love her, follow your heart. Then person 6 tells him, listen, dude, thing about good looks is they don't last. So if you marry someone because she's 25 and she looks like a supermodel right now, you got to ask yourself, what will she look like when she's 75? Because it's unfair to expect a woman to look like a 25-year-old supermodel over the course of 50 years. That just goes against nature. So you better be basing your relationship on something that is a bit more permanent than fleeting good looks. Otherwise, if there are no other common bases between the two of you, you will not have friendship and your relationship is not going to survive the test of time. So this guy takes all those opinions into account, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 is the only one which was like the minority report, which told him don't base a relationship on physical attraction, which is going to end shortly. And then he says, let me do the right thing. So 5 people said yes, 1 person said no. So I'm just going to marry this woman because I find her so attractive and I'm in love with her right now. That is rashness. He has not weighed up. He has not. Sorry, that's not rashness. That's thoughtlessness. Rashness would be like if he didn't bother to ask anyone. Thoughtlessness is where he did ask people, he did get advice, but he failed to weigh it up slowly. Another way of thinking of judgment. So the opposite of thoughtlessness is judgment, according to what St. Thomas said. The opposite of thoughtlessness is judgment. Another way to understand this better is to think of a synonym for judgment is deliberation. To weigh things up slowly, in a very intentional way, and to think slowly through things. So not doing that, that is thoughtlessness. So this person, when he says, hey, 5 people said marry her, 1 person said don't marry her, so I'm going to marry her, go with the majority. That, even though he was not being rash, he was being thoughtless. So he sought advice, but he didn't weigh it up. So that's the difference between thoughtlessness and rashness. The 4th act is the reason's command about the thing to be done, and it is also impeded by lust, insofar as through being carried away by concupiscence, a man is hindered from doing what his reason ordered to be done. In other words, you have thought about something, you have sought advice, and then you realize this is a course of action to do, but then you just don't do it. You simply do not do it. That is what is referred to as inconstancy, and this is it's a kind of weakness, really. A kind of weakness, and that is another result of lust. Hence, Terence says in the same play, The Eunuch, of a man who declared that he would leave his mistress. One little false tear will undo those words. You know, for me, it's very interesting. Side note, because I work as a screenwriter, and one of the at the moment, and one of the interesting things is you know, it's not a common thing to find Catholic saints who quote fiction or plays. It's a rare thing. St. Thomas does it. For me, that was like, wow, there's an openness of mind to whatever is true and to whatever is good. And it's just very refreshing. Just a sidebar. Just, you know, St. Thomas, I'm sure if William Shakespeare had lived before St. Thomas Aquinas would probably be quoting Shakespeare. But that's a by the way. Moving on the part of the will. So remember we were speaking about the internal acts of the intellect. Now, on the part of the will, there results a twofold inordinate act. One is the desire for the end, to which we refer self-love, which regards the pleasure which a man desires inordinately, while on the other hand there is hatred of God by reason of his forbidding the desired pleasure. Now, let's take a step back. This is a mouthful. Let's try and unpack it. To unpack this, we have to understand a couple of concepts. Concept number 1 is the moral life, the life of virtue. The moral refers to the life of the will. So when it comes to virtues, the main thing is the will. What do you want? What do you intend? What is your intention? This is what colors an act as being morally right or morally wrong. Now, before you can want something, your intellect has to come into play and tell you, this is a good thing to want. You should actually want this thing because it is good. So the intellect plays that role of apprehending what is good. In that respect, the intellect has what is known as primacy of operation. It's like you've got 2 legs, and one is the intellect, one is the will. The intellect always goes first. It always goes first. The will follows the intellect. After the intellect tells it, hey, this is good, because the intellect has been well formed, and the intellect can weigh out things, and the intellect can seek advice, and then the intellect can command an action and say, this is what has to be done. Then the will checks in. Then the will is the one that actually carries out that action and orders the rest of all our faculties towards doing that thing. So for instance, you see an ice cream and you're like, whoa, this is black vanilla, my favorite flavor, so difficult to find. But it's Lent. I should be fasting and avoiding these things. But it's my friend's birthday, and we've gone to this restaurant, and this is the only restaurant in my city where they have black vanilla, and I'll never come here again for I don't know how long. So should I or shouldn't I? Should I or shouldn't I? Then your intellect tells you, because it's been well formed, okay, go ahead, but maybe don't have a drink. Maybe don't have your favorite drink. Maybe just drink water, and then swap that out. So your intellect has, in that instant, it's taken a lot of things. It's like what it's read, what it remembers, what it's apprehending as good, and then it's telling you do this action. So now the will steps forward and says, okay, hand, okay, mouth, tell the waiter, I want this thing. Please give me 2 scoops of black vanilla ice cream, for instance. So that's the, and you see from that, the will it's our superpower. The will has what is known as, so remember we said the intellect has primacy of operation, the will has primacy of domination. So the will controls everything. The will is so powerful that the will can stop the intellect from thinking. So the will has primacy of domination even over the intellect. That is why you can tell someone, listen, this is bad. Don't do this. I beg you, do not do this. You see this a lot with people who are addicts, right? The person can tell you, listen, I know that this drug or this alcohol is going to kill me. It's going to end my life. It's going to destroy me. It's going to cook up my liver and leave me dead. But you know what? It's all right. I'm still going to drink myself to death. It's fine. That is an example of the dominance of the will. The will can, even though the intellect tells it, don't do this, this is bad, this is not going to work, etc., etc., the will can be like, it's all right, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so the will has that primacy of domination. After the intellect tells it something, the will then says, all right, cool, let us or let us not do this. So now this second part is referring to, on the part of the will, on the part of wanting what is good, there results a twofold inordinate act. One is the desire for the end, to which we refer self-love. So the will, remember, the moral life is the life of the will, and the moral virtues protect the will from the onslaught of emotions and passions. And the good of reason or the good of the will predominantly is in 2 phases, 2 things: choosing the right end and choosing the right means to attain that end. And when a person chooses the wrong end, if you look at it from let's call it a long-term point of view, or if you scratch beneath the surface, every single time when we choose a wrong end, we are basically choosing ourselves over God. That is what this point refers to. One is a desire for the end, to which we refer self-love, which regards the pleasure which a man desires inordinately, while on the other hand there is hatred of God by reason of his forbidding the desired pleasure. So in other words, lust makes us always choose ourselves as the end of as the ultimate end. We say, I am the ultimate end of my actions. I'm choosing myself over God. And because God tells me that these things are wrong, which I want, which I desire, which I'm going after, you know what? I actually hate him because he's kind of standing in my way. He's an obstacle. He's like pricking my conscience. So I hate God. So on the other hand, there is hatred of God. The other act is the desire for the things directed to the end. In other words, choosing the right means, desiring the right means to achieve that end. With regard to this, there is love of this world, whose pleasures a man desires to enjoy, while on the other hand, there is despair of a future world, because through being held back by carnal pleasures, he cares not to obtain spiritual pleasures, since they are distasteful to him. So in other words, once the person has chosen himself and his own pleasure instead of God, and he hates God, the next thing is he's going to love every single thing in this world which will enable him to achieve that pleasure, that sexual pleasure, because remember we're speaking about lust, that sexual pleasure which he has sought. Now, Because that sexual pleasure, which has become the most important thing in his life, can only be found in this world. Hence, St. Thomas says, with regards to this, there is love of this world, whose pleasures a man desires to enjoy, while on the other hand, there is despair of a future world. In fact, I would argue that a good number of practical atheists, so a practical atheist is someone who, yeah, they haven't written books and they don't have podcasts, proclaiming how atheistic they are, but just in terms of their day-to-day life, the way they think, and as a result, the way they behave, it's like God doesn't exist. I would argue that a vast majority of practical atheists in the world today are so because of lust, where they realize inadvertently, indirectly, they haven't admitted it to themselves, but they realize that in order to maximize pleasure, pleasure can only be found in the things of this world. And so I am going to do my utmost to live for the things of this world. And what that does is it blinds you. It makes you lose focus on the things of the next world. And so we live in this, like, almost, let's call it an unchristian fear of death. You like death is not something to be accepted, not to be thought of, not to be considered. And if it is to be considered or thought of, it's only within the point of view of avoiding it, delaying it, increasing our longevity, trying to live to the age of 100, doing whatever it takes to remain young no matter what. Basically, and that's like not aging gracefully, because you've refused to accept the fact that death is a reality and death comes for hence it is referred to as the way of all flesh. Only he or she who is not flesh will not encounter death. But the person is so afraid of death because it will take them away from the pleasures of this life that they do whatever it takes to avoid it beyond what is reasonable. I'm not saying that if a doctor tells you, listen, you really need to, stop eating that and that, otherwise you're going to get a heart attack. You say, listen, I'm not afraid of death. I'm going to keep eating this and that so that I can get a heart attack and I'm just going to ride out and enjoy my life. No, that's not what I mean. I mean within the bounds of reason, within the bounds of reason. So if a person starts taking all sorts of chemicals to change their DNA and all sorts of weird, frontier treatments to increase their longevity and wants to like freeze themselves so that they can, I don't know. You hear all sorts of weird and wacky stories of things people do so that they can live forever. All of that points towards this thing of despair of the next life because of a life that is rooted in seeking the pleasures of this world, which is one of the results of lust. Because there's that despair of a future world because through being held back by carnal pleasures, he cares not to obtain spiritual pleasures since they're distasteful to him. And I would argue that the reason why, let me put it this way. There are many people I've come across who have a deep distaste for spiritual things. The person who, when they think of reading the Bible, they'd pick it up once and then they just find the word so alien and strange and has nothing to do with them and they put it down. Or the person who, if they're at a gathering and someone says, okay, let's pray, something within them recoils and they feel weird. Or the person who, they go to church but they just stand outside. There's a kind of distaste for spiritual things, right? And the actual term for this distaste for spiritual things, the actual term for it is sloth or acedia, laziness, fear of effort when it comes to spiritual things because there's not that much pleasure associated with them. And there's a connection here between lust and that distaste for spiritual things. How does one overcome it? Well, you have to overcome it in different ways at the same time. You have to tackle the lust and you have to tackle the distaste. But one thing that St. Thomas says about tackling this distaste for spiritual things is, and this was advice he gave in the 13th century, which if we get to the article on sloth or sloth, he's going to mention it and we shall unpack it a little bit more. But one of the things he says to overcome this thing where you recoil when you think of spiritual things is to get into the practice of visualizing. Basically, how he puts it is, think often of spiritual goods and this will reduce your fear of effort with respect to those spiritual goods. In other words, he's saying visualize. Visualize yourself praying, visualize yourself in church, visualize yourself with the rosary beads in your hand, Visualize yourself reading the Bible. Do that over and over and over and over again. And eventually, when the time comes for you to be in church or to say the rosary or to pray with friends or to read the Bible, the distaste will reduce. I found it fascinating, mind blowing, that someone in the 13th century was giving advice which nowadays I guess is kind of associated with the new age movement of, visualize and have a vision board and manifest, etc., etc. There is some truth to that. St. Thomas spoke about it in the 13th century. And if you visualize yourself doing something spiritual over and over and over and over, when the time comes for you to do that action, the distaste will have reduced. And that brings us to the end of the discussion around the body of the article itself. And in the next episode, we shall begin with St. Thomas Aquinas' reply to the first objection that is given to the question whether the daughters of lust are numbered accurately.